Aloha kako. My name is Vernadette Gonzalez. I'm a professor of American Studies at the University of Hawaiʻi at Mānoa.
And aloha everyone, my name is Hōkūlani Aikau, and I am tuning in from my home that is on Lekwungen territory in what we now call Victoria, an island way up north in the Pacific. It's good to be here with y'all today. So while it started off as a guidebook, it evolved into a guide to decolonization. It takes on some of the conceits of the guidebook, but decenters the tourist gaze, reorienting relationships to place according to what contributes to a consciousness and the broader work of decolonization. Indeed, while we initially saw tourists as the first audience for this project, we've come to center residents of Hawaii, native and non-native alike, who, as a result of settler colonialism and our assimilationist educational system, may not themselves know the indigenous histories under the concrete and steel of tourism and development. As the project evolved, the question of how one could write about Hawaii differently and decolonially expanded to include questions of language and translation, as well as what could and what should be written about, and also what could and should be left out. With regards to language, one thing we liked about guidebooks is the accessible level of prose. We asked our contributors to aim for a general audience while balancing this request with also pushing our readers to learn certain terms like decolonial, settler colonialism, which are needed to name how power works in this context. Later in the process, the question of how to write also became one of using and translating Hawaiian terms. For some pieces, this worked, and for others whose writers pushed back, it didn't. As editors, Vernadette and I, it was a learning moment for us, and it pushed us to include a note on translation in the introduction, and also to include a brief glossary. With regard to content, what should a guidebook or guide include? Given that the guidebook relies on a promise of ultimate access, our contributors and we wanted to clarify that writing about a place was not necessarily an open invitation. Some were specific about the things they would write about and the things they did not. Others laid out protocol for visitation or involvement or non-involvement, the eventual framing of ideas of the guide versus guide, the eventual framing ideas of the guide versus guidebook and individual pieces themselves thus highlight the kinds of protocols of access and knowledge that we wanted to balance. Detours offers an alternative encounter with place through a range of storytelling that is tied to place-based responsibility. Its ultimate vision is to contribute to a broader decolonial movement in Hawaii.
So our goals for the book are twofold. So the first is that we sought to interrupt tourism's hold on the narratives about Hawaii and provide alternative viewpoints and approaches that allow for a deeper understanding of what lies beneath the facade of paradise. Second, the essays, personal reflection, art, and maps that make up Detours provide examples of how activists, academics, and community members are working to radically disrupt these frames to restore and nurture Ea, what Noelani Goodyear Kauipua has described as sovereignty, life, breath that requires constant action. Although the book was initially inspired by the guidebook genre, its evolution as a guide to decolonization instead invites the reader to understand Hawaii outside of that tourist gaze and participate in tours or activities that unsettle for one mass tourism. In its curation of stories about place and relationships of accountability to place, it actively contributes to and illuminates part of a broad and multifaceted effort toward decolonizing Hawaii. Many of the contributors are involved in active efforts towards social justice, reparation, and historical responsibility. Unlike the guidebook, whose audience is the tourist or visitor looking to consume Hawaii, we seek the kinds of readers that are looking to be transformed, those who are seeking examples of how real people can disrupt and transform dominant ways of encountering and apprehending Hawaii.
So in sum, this is a guide that considers the different ways that communities and other groups work together toward restoring Ea, the breath and sovereignty of the Lahui, Aina, and its people. The Lahui Hawai'i has tactically, strategically, and persistently resisted dismemberment and military occupation. The stories, poetry, and art gathered in this book include concrete examples of how we move from metaphors of decolonization to material practices and everyday acts of resurgence that bring about real change in the lives of people, transforming our relationships with land as Aina so it can better feed us again. And here I'm going to read extensively from our introduction in the book. While this is a guide, it should not be construed as a blanket invitation. Not everyone who reads this book will be invited or allowed to go to all of the places that are described. There are places and knowledge that have been left out altogether because they are not meant for outsiders. We honor the wishes of the community who have asked that this book not be an open invitation to visitors. We ask that you respect their wishes and follow their protocol for how to engage or not. Sometimes the best way to support decolonization and Kanaka Ōiwi resurgence is to not come as a tourist to our home. The hour in this sentence recognizes that Kanaka and Kanaka call this place home, and that we all need to relearn how to live here in radically different ways if the Aina and Vai, land and water, are going to be able to support Ho'e, people, human beings, into the future. Thus, an important underlying assumption of this book is that not all knowledge, information, or access to places is open and available to everyone. We understand that within a touristic framework, this is radically audacious, but we ask the reader to proceed with caution and restraint. We also recognize that this uninvitation might be disconcerting, and it should be. Hawaii, as ideal tourist destination made possible by an infrastructure built for and around visitors' comfort, safety, and pleasure. That infrastructure and the ideas, values, decisions that support it were and are built on the historical and present day dispossession of Kanaka Ōiwi. Unless we actively work to dismantle this infrastructure and refuse the tourist imaginary, we will, wittingly or unwittingly, contribute to reproducing the occupation and colonization of these places, people, and practices. We ask readers to contribute to preparing for a different future. If this knowledge at all makes them uneasy, and if they want to approach and engage Hawaii differently with a sense of pono and kuleana, then we invite them to join with us on this Huaka'i, this transformative journey. Instead of looking at what Hawaii can offer the reader, and it has much to offer beyond sun and sand, we ask you to think instead of what you can learn from and contribute to ongoing efforts towards sustaining ea. So as we moved away from the guidebook, we also thought about the organization of the book differently. At first, we found the value of the guidebook, but guidebook's differentiation of Hawaii by islands useful, but then we quickly moved away from that and came up with a thematic organization for the table of contents. And while we've organized them according to these different themes, we also recognize that there was some overlap, and some of the pieces could be located in multiple places. So the table of contents really begins with place and then moves from there. First, we have part one is Wahi Pana, storied places, and it lingers on a number of places whose histories have been forgotten, buried, or misrepresented. Tourism and its sibling development have had a lot to do with how the deep histories of these sites have faded from contemporary view or from memory, or re-narrated only in terms of tourist access and consumption. So in Hawaii, Wahi Pana is the term used to designate a place as sacred or legendary. There are a number of pieces that coalesced around genealogical stories of place, love letters, or elegies in written and visual form. And for this section, we want to highlight several pieces of place-based storytelling that drive home how even the notion of place and directionality are always under duress in Hawaii, and how Indigenous acts of remembering place and passing that knowledge on are part of a larger decolonial strategy.
So the first, which is Kapolani Landgraph series Pono'iwi, presents a series of manipulated photographs of places on Maui. Hōkūlani draws our attention to Ke One Hanau and Ke Kula'iwi, the birth sands and burial sites of generations of Ōiwi ancestors that have been desecrated by the construction industry on both Maui and Oahu. In her artist statement, Hōkūlani outlines the history of sand extraction for construction, describing how this process essentially mined the beaches of the islands in order to build roads, buildings, and bases. In this image, text describing the location of a heiau that was located at the base of the pu'u borders the open wound of the land that has been excavated, encircling the violence that ripped it apart with a chant of memory. Here's another image. Hōkūlani clarifies the double violence at work in this moment, leaving no border between the land and the iwi. She says, Native Hawaiians buried the iwi, the bones of their ancestors, within the sand dunes throughout Hawaii. They believed the mana of the person lived in the bones. Ola na iwi, the bones live. At Hono Kahua, Maui, in 1989, over 1,000 Native Hawaiian remains were removed to build the Ritz-Carlton Kapalua Resort. So despite the 1990 law protecting burial sites, Hōkūlani states that there is continued pressure to develop Hawaiian Aina, and Hawaiian iwi are constantly threatened. She asked, Nawai e ho'ola ina iwi, who will protect our bones? So in these decidedly not exotic and lush landscape images, Hōkūlani uses text to show the incursions and violence upon the land, which renders it into base material for extraction under a capitalist regime, rather than as Aina, as ancestor and living kin.
So in the Wahi Pana section, orientation to place, directionality, and positionality are also structuring themes. The piece that begins the section is Kamana Beamer's essay, whose humorous story about giving tourist directions to Kona Airport opens. When tourists ask him directions to the airport, he replies, about 20 ahupua'a to the south. And in that answer, he drives home an indigenous system of Palena place boundaries and establishes, quote, a more intimate knowledge of Hawaiian geography and place that is built on relationality rather than ownership. And in her poem, Waikiki on Google Maps satellite view, Brandy Nalani McDougall contrasts Google's cartography of Ili'i with indigenous memory. The first stanza shows how Ili'i have been reduced to street names. In Waikiki, Lili'u Ōiwi is just a few blocks from the Royal Hawaiian Shopping Center and runs Mauka from Kalakaua to the Alawai. Kuhio meets with her amidst vacation condos. Here, Ali'i names designate shopping and lodging in Waikiki's tourist jungle. The last stanza is a poignant reminder of what remains and what remains to be taken back. Search the brown canal water that once fed the marshes for any part of us that is still ours. Whatever remains after even the names of our kings and queens have been taken, left roaming the streets. McDougall's intentions for this poem, for these poems, quote, to have the mo'olelo of these places made more visible, even when they are only a hint at a deeper history and meaning, to highlight the tensions arising from using both mapping technologies and to draw attention to the ways using Google Maps aligns its users with colonial thinking and realities. Her intention is to unsettle the universality of knowledge and access that these new technologies promise, which run counter to indigenous relationships to land, which are evident in our mo'olelo.
Part 3, Huaka'i, tours and itineraries, feature actual tours in practice that address geographic, environmental, social, and political issues on the islands, transformative practices of journeying that have been revived, or imaginative itineraries that unsettle tourism mobilities. So a Huaka'i, we want to point out, is not an empty itinerary, but rather a journey defined by intention. So this purposefulness is crucial. It is demanding. The Huaka'i that are offered in this section have very precise aims of moving people through a place and providing new ways of looking at and interacting with some of the histories, struggles, and relationships that shape Hawaii. It demands that you journey with deliberation and an openness to being disquieted by what you might learn about the place and yourself. It will place you in relationships to people and to the land that you might not expect, and which will demand something of you, a shift in perspective, an injunction to take action, a challenge to get involved. So Kyle Kajihiro and Auntie Terry Keko'olani created the original Detour in Hawaii. They have given us their blessing to, they gave us their blessing to use the term for the title of this book. Kyle and Auntie Terry's activist work as advocates of demilitarization led them to create the demilitarization tours, which exposed the US military's social and environmental impacts in Hawaii. It unsettled its claims to Hawaiian land and revitalized Hawaiian place names and stories, and also finally lend support to Kanaka Maoli resistance and resurgence initiatives.
So their Huaka'i traces one of their standard routes, which includes 4 main sites: the Iolani Palace, Halava at Camp Smith, the Pearl Harbor War Memorial, and Hanakehau Farm in Waiava. At the Iolani Palace, they examine the Hawaiian Kingdom, the economic, geopolitical, and ideological factors driving the US-backed overthrow of the monarchy, and the prolonged military occupation of Hawaii. The palace provides a setting for telling stories of continuous Hawaiian resistance to annexation and the contemporary use of the palace as a gathering place and symbol of the Hawaiian independence movement. At Camp Smith, Kyle and Auntie Terry's detour moves on from Iolani Palace. Kyle and Auntie Terry's detour moves on to Camp Smith, the headquarters of the US Pacific Command, where they discuss how Keawalau o Pu'uloa, also known as Pearl Harbor, was crucial to US imperial expansion across the Pacific. Standing at the head of the monstrous military octopus, they narrate the various manifestations of militarization and its impact in Hawaii and the Pacific region. From there, they go down the hill and arrive at Pearl Harbor Memorial. There, they recall Hawaiian place names and stories and critically interrogate the discourse of innocence and security that legitimizes and naturalizes the US presence in Hawaii. And finally, at Hanakehau Farm, the tourist participants learn about an initiative to restore Hawaiian cultural knowledge and land use practices in the shadow of the ruined environment of Pearl Harbor. This Huaka'i narration concludes with thoughts about consequences of military policies that implicate Hawaii in America's war against peoples in distant lands and our responsibilities to address both the impacts of militarization locally and abroad.
Part 4, Beyond the Big Eight, offers new mappings of Hawaii that disrupt the notion that Hawaii is geographically bounded by the 8 main islands. So while this guidebook thus far is focused on the importance of place and particularly of Hawaii as Aina, it is just as important to understand the boundaries of Hawaii stretch to all the places where Kanaka Ōiwi visit, live, dwell, and die. In other words, while the islands are crucial to Hawaiian sovereignty and identity, they are a piko, an umbilical cord that connects Kanaka Ōiwi to their collective ancestral homelands, and not a measure of authenticity or a boundary. Hawaiians have always voyaged by choice beyond the shores of the islands. As David Chang notes in his contribution, Kanaka Ōiwi have a long tradition of voyaging and have themselves been part of explorations and migrations that have crisscrossed the Pacific and beyond. Challenging the notion that natives stay and others go, Chang's historical mapping of the routes that Hawaiians have long traveled is an important corrective to assumptions that Indigenous people are fixed both in place and time. He asks, quote, as Indigenous people of one land who are living on the lands of other Indigenous people, what is the kuleana of Ōiwi in diaspora? What are their obligations born of their genealogy and of their connections to place? Pehea la e pono'ai. What is the right way to act in such circumstances? For Kanaka in diaspora, the question is a real one, unquote. These questions are very real for the non-Kanaka visitors who come to Hawaii for vacation, as well as for those who migrate to these shores to live. So our book tries to pose to the reader, what is your kuleana and how will you carry it?
At the same time, Hawaiians have been forced to move because of political, economic, and social conditions beyond their control, such as a prison industrial system that has systematically exported disproportionate numbers of Kanaka Ōiwi to the arid lands of Turtle Island. In this new carceral mapping, the strain of a discriminatory legal system disperses the family and the community and strains at the ties that bind us to homelands. This last section is crucial. Hawaiians do not stop being Hawaiian when they leave Hawaii, and their familial relations and their familial relationships, and nor do their ethical obligations to each other and the Aina end. People who come to settle in Hawaii from elsewhere bring with them the memories of their lands, even as they have been displaced. We are still Kama Aina, even when on the land of other ancestors and lands feed us. In traveling elsewhere, we are also bound by decolonial ethics to restore and support the ea of the lands and people wherever we may dwell. And this is real for me as I live up here in the lands of the Lekwungen people. For this section, we want to highlight the contribution of Linda Ferruto, a teacher of ethnomathematics at UH Mānoa, who was fortunate to take part in the educational worldwide voyage of the Hōkūlani, a canoe that traverses the world through the traditional non-instrument wayfinding. First built and launched in the 1970s, the Hōkūlani symbolized the revival of Indigenous ocean exploration and navigation. More than that, however, its mission is also very much tied to the protection and proliferation of the values of the people of the Pacific. Narrating her particular legs of the journey, Ferruto discusses the kinds of knowledge exchanges with various global communities that she encounters during the voyages. A particularly insightful moment was when they returned to the United States, and it sheds light on the protocols that need to re-emerge for decolonialism to be instructive.
So this is a short section from Ferruto's piece. En route to Manahata, the crew members requested permission from the First Nations to enter their lands in Chesapeake Bay. As Hōkūlani approached from the distance, the original stewards gathered at the dock waiting for her arrival. Chief Billy Tayak of the Piscataway Nation and Chairman Francis Gray of the Piscataway Kanoi tribe gave the signal that allowed the PBS crew members to join them ashore, and then extended an invitation to participate in a solemn ceremony. The Hawaii delegation entered with traditional genealogical chants, mele and hula, acknowledging respect for our Native American host. Ho'okalepa Baibayan formally requested permission to enter the Piscataway land and reflected on the mission of the Malama Honua worldwide voyage. To seal the ceremony, Chief Tayak resolutely expressed, "You are the second vessel to enter this area in 400 years, and you are the first to ask for permission. It is our great hope that together we will be able to reverse some of the damage that was caused by the first vessel." So, unquote. So in many ways, this exchange marks the kind of principles and protocols that Detours as a book wants to establish with its guide to decolonialism here in Hawaii. Permission, reciprocity, responsibility, and the way that we think about it, and our contributors think about it. These are portable values for wherever we travel or settle.
I think Kathy is asking, agree it's important for many to read and relearn what we thought we knew. Just curious, would this book ever be displayed in the same section as the typical tourist guide books? When I've seen, it is, I think, in the, like, if a bookstore were to carry it, it would be in the travel guide section of the bookstore. So in that way, yes.
I think it was when it first came out, I went to Barnes and Noble to see where it would go. And somebody said, they were sort of side by side, but like there was a way in which, like, we want people to pick it up and think they're getting a guidebook that is what they were expecting and then be surprised, right? Like be engaged in a different way, and maybe made to think about, well, what were the kinds of things I was expecting, or about this type of book? Because the cover also, and unfortunately my copy is in the other room, the cover is also sort of a play on like the look of the guidebook. We worked with the designers who are amazing at Duke University Press to kind of riff off of that look, right? There's a certain way in which it looks, but then the image that we have has like a rusty fence. It's the wall, the sort of boarded up wall that is down at Kaimana Beach, right? So we just kind of wanted to kind of play that off a bit.